welcome to our second plenary talk. Our speaker this morning will be Dr. E. Christian Kopff, who you heard some about yesterday. From fall 2004 to 2011, he served as founding director of the Center for Western Civilization. As a fellow of the American Academy in Rome, he edited a critical edition of the Greek text of Euripides' Bacchae. He wrote The Devil Knows Latin, Why America Needs the Classical Tradition, and translated Joseph Pieper, Tradition, Concept, and Claim. He has received the Hero of Conscience Award from the American Freedom Alliance for his commitment to the advancement of Western ideals and values, and the designation Magister Magnus from the Consortium for Classical Lutheran Education. He works with the classicists of the University of Urbino, Italy, on the meter and colorimetry of the choruses of ancient Greek tragedy. He studies ancient texts and traditions from science to Sophocles that remain important, including what the ancient Athenians called democracy and the religion of the Bible. Please welcome Dr. Kopff.
Good morning. It's great to be here, and it was great, if I may put a brief nod to yesterday's plenary, to be reminded by Pastor of the adventures we've been through and the things that have happened. There were a lot of things he mentioned I remembered very well. It was like yesterday, so it was a great moment. Today I'd like to talk about a slightly different topic, but also one that involves telling stories. Classical Lutheran education gives students a balanced worldview through teaching the arts of language, the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the arts of mathematics, the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, or science and the arts. It expands their knowledge and vocabulary by teaching the languages and literatures of Greece and Rome. It also introduces students to great people, such as Jesus and Socrates, men we know about principally and most significantly through the Greek texts about them. This talk will explore another important figure in language, education, philosophy, and politics, Marcus Tullius Cicero, Cicero, who lived from 106 to 43 BC. Cicero was a role model for the Italian Renaissance of Petrarch and the Florentine Republic. He haunted the imagination of Luther Melanchthon, whose praise of Cicero converted Protestant Europe from Aristotle. In the 18th century, he inspired the lives and accomplishments of figures as diverse as the Count of Montesquieu, philosopher David Hume, founding father John Adams, and Whig statesman Edmund Burke. As the great American historian Charles Austin Beard pointed out, Cicero's character and speeches helped America confront the challenges faced by a republic with an empire. Could he play a similar role in our country today? Let's follow the example of Homer and Virgil and proceed in medias res, into the middle, as Horace put it. Though I ought to say, we're proceeding in the middle of Cicero's influence on European culture. It's actually going to be about the beginning of our story as Americans. In the 17th century, Englishmen crossed the Atlantic to plant colonies in North America. Virginia and South Carolina enjoyed warm climates and rich soil suitable for money crops like tobacco and rice and eventually cotton. Settlers in what came to be called New England faced cold winters and less fertile soil. After 2 decades, 1619 to 1639, memorably described in William Bradford's classic account of Plymouth Plantation, the Massachusetts Bay Colony felt it was time to found a college. What skills did the new Harvard College ask of potential leaders of a people who had to wring sustenance from the New England soil and prevent attacks from Indians? They had a lot of technical problems face them. The first entrance requirement to Harvard College, published in 1642, was, quotes, be able to read Tully or such like classical Latin author extempore, end quotes. Extempore means without a dictionary, and Tully is our word for Cicero, who was Marcus Tullius Cicero, just as the great historian Livius is Livy in English, and the important imperial epistolographer, writer of letters, Plinius, is Pliny in English. And indeed, we usually hear him referred to as Tully in the 17th and 18th centuries. This requirement was not a peculiarity of the Puritan founders of Harvard. A Cicero requirement is found in the records of other colonial colleges. William and Mary, founded in 1693. Yale, founded in 1701. The College of New Jersey, founded in 1746, later called Princeton. King's College of New York, founded in 1754, later called Columbia. Why did the American colonists want young men to demonstrate their ability to read the orations and dialogues of Cicero before entering on a college education? A Cicero entrance requirement for college does not fit the image of American settlers as living a life free from the dead hand of the past. 1783, last year of our revolution, French immigrant Hector St. John de Crèvecoeur, in his book, Letters from an American Farmer, asked that fateful question, quotes, what then is the American, this new man, end quotes. And de Crèvecoeur answered, he, italics in the original, he is an American who, leaving behind him all his ancient prejudices and manners, receives new ones from the new mode of life he has embraced, the new government he obeys, and the new rank he holds, end quotes. Similarly, distinguished political thinker Charles Murray, in his pamphlet American Exceptionalism, published in 2013, describes the United States on Inauguration Day 1789 in the following words, quotes, this is Charles Murray, quotes, 4 million people spread out over 13 colonies, stretching from New England to Georgia, have separated themselves from the world's greatest power and then invented a new nation from scratch, end quotes. But was it really from scratch, as Murray says, and did they really leave behind all their ancient prejudices and manners, end quotes, as de Crèvecoeur put it. In the 1830s, another Frenchman came to America. He was here to do research, not to become an immigrant, and his name was Alexis de Tocqueville. And de Tocqueville in Democracy in America saw things differently, at least in his first volume. America, he wrote, quotes, America was a new country, but the people who inhabited it had elsewhere made a long use of liberty, end quotes. L'Amérique était une contrée nouvelle, cependant, le peuple qui l'habitait avait déjà fait ailleurs un long usage de la liberté. England indeed had a parliament, and Englishmen had been reading about and studying liberty for a long time. And when they founded a college in Boston to ensure the education of pastors, lawyers, and doctors, the first thing they wanted to be sure about was that these future leaders of their new society could read Cicero. Cicero had provided an important part of the reading of educated people for a long time. In his own lifetime, in the ancient world, in the medieval Europe from the age of Charlemagne up to the 14th century, when there was a change took place. They read ethical dialogues like the Tusculan Disputations and the De Officiis on duties, and rhetorical treatises, especially in the age of Charlemagne, Ad Herennium and De Inventione. In the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas based his discussion of the virtues on De Officiis, on Cicero. In the next century, Dante quotes Cicero some 50 times, according to Gilbert Hyatt. He was a respected and authoritative figure. In the middle of the 14th century, something changed. The 13th and 14th centuries were the age of scholasticism, philosophical theology, featuring thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus, and William of Ockham. From the middle of the 14th century, the age of Petrarch begins. Petrarch spent much of his life working at the papal court in Avignon. Papacy was not in Rome in most of the 14th century. It was in southern France, in the still lovely city of Avignon. Petrarch is considered by most intellectual scholars the first humanist. That is, a Christian in awe of the pagan classical past. He admired Cicero, but he always carried with him his copy of Augustine's Confessions. He ransacked the monastic libraries of Europe, hunting for texts of Livy and Cicero. In 1345, he made a sensational discovery in Verona, in northern Italy, a manuscript of the letters of Cicero to Atticus, his best friend, and Brutus. The Cicero of the letters was not the wise moral philosopher of De Officiis and the Tusculan Disputations, but a passionate political advocate, a Roman aristocrat obsessed with maintaining his prestige by political maneuvering and buying expensive homes on the Palatine Hill in Rome and near the Bay of Naples. Petrarch was shocked to discover a Cicero who was no model of virtue and calm wisdom, but a passionate and ambitious politician. In imitation of Cicero, Petrarch published two collections of his own letters to friends and patrons. He also wrote letters to the great writers of the past. In fact, he wrote two of them to Cicero, the second one apologizing for the first one. Petrarch admired Cicero's ethical ideals and his magnificent prose style, but he objected to Cicero's political ambitions, which he blamed for his bloody death. As English poet Thomas Gray was to put it 400 years later, the paths of glory lead but to the grave. For Petrarch, Cicero was the acknowledged master of a clear and forceful Latin. Increasingly, however, the Cicero who mattered in the Renaissance mattered for who he was as much as what he wrote. Cicero was a popular politician who rose to the highest elective office in Republican Rome, the consulship. He was a successful defense attorney who also prosecuted a few major cases, especially the corrupt and oppressive governor of Sicily, Gaius Verres. He composed dialogues on rhetoric, politics, and ethics that transmitted these topics to posterity. His letters are models of the genre. His range of accomplishments inspired the ideal of the Renaissance man, the man for all seasons, homo omnium horarum, as Erasmus called his friend, Thomas More. The Cicero who wrote influential political and ethical treatises, but also led an active political life, appealed to the cultured and politically active leaders of Renaissance Florence. William of Ockham was a master of logic, and that was admirable. But Cicero lived his ideas and ideals. His influence as author, orator, master stylist, and model citizen began in his lifetime and continued throughout the ancient world and the medieval world. His influence on rhetoric, the third and culminating liberal art of language, rested on the variety of his works. Practical essays like De Inventione, theoretical dialogues like De Oratore, and actual speeches. We possess 58 of his 88 recorded speeches. His ethical dialogues, De Officiis on duties and Tusculan Disputations, have been especially and continuously influential since the ancient world. St. Ambrose in the 4th century AD composed a Christianized De Officiis. In the 13th century, Cicero was a major source of the treatise on law in Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, first part of the second part, questions 90 through 97. For 2 generations at the end of the 14th century and the beginning of the 15th, Florence elected humanists as their leaders. They admired Cicero, and they strove to make Florence a republic like the one Cicero tried to save and renew. Like Cicero, they eventually failed. defeated not by military conquerors like Julius Caesar, but by the subtler machinations of brilliant financiers, especially the bankers Cosimo and Lorenzo de' Medici, who used high finance to control Florence, influence European politics, and buy the loyalty of humanists and creative artists. And no one did more for the creative arts in history than the de' Medici family. There's no question about that. But they used it to obtain political power. As Sinclair Lewis wrote in one of his novels, which is not one of his greatest novels, but has a great title, Can't Happen Here. No, rich people will never influence politics in this country. That's why we prefer to study Julius Caesar, right, and not the Medici. That's the background of the Puritan founders of Massachusetts, making Cicero the requirement to get into Harvard. It'd be great if we could reinstitute that requirement. In fact, the Secretary of Defense is a fan of classical Christian education. Just get the military academies to have a Cicero requirement. We could see a lot of things change. Let's skip ahead. In the 16th century, the next century, Martin Luther was an educational reformer before he became a religious reformer. In fact, we would say the religious reformer. When he took up the chair of expounding the Bible, Lectura in Biblia, in 1513, the newly founded University of Wittenberg had 8 professors of scholastic theology, 4 Thomists and 4 Scotus. They represented what's known as the Via Antiqua, the old way. The conservative elector, Frederick, didn't have much use for the Via Moderna, the modern way. We're suspicious of it. Luther worked with Georg Spalatin, father confessor and advisor of the elector, Frederick the Wise, to win the elector over to their goal of replacing scholasticism with a humanist curriculum emphasizing the ancient tongues. Ernst Schwiebert gives us the result in his useful book, The Reformation as a University Movement. Schwiebert wrote, quotes, "This caused the development of an entirely new school in which the restoration of Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, and the teaching of the Church Fathers were to be studied in the original languages in which they were written," end quotes. Before this happened, however, Luther was already exemplifying humanism in his teaching. The professors of scholasticism taught the relatively recent theories of the theologians of the 13th and 14th centuries and their intellectual heirs. Dialectic, logic replaced rhetoric as the crown of the arts of language. Luther expounded the text of the Bible in the original languages with the aid of the ancient church fathers. As he explained in 1539 in his important essay on the councils in the church, quotes, "Let them take a book of the Bible and look at the glosses of the fathers, and the same thing will happen to them that happened to me when I took up the Epistle to Hebrews with the gloss of St. Chrysostom, Titus and Galatians with the help of St. Jerome, Genesis with the help of St. Ambrose, St. Augustine, the Psalter with all the exegetes I could find, and so on," end quotes. The goal was not to contribute to an academic debate, but return to the sources, ad fontes, primarily the Bible, and then Augustine and other doctors of the church. John Lang, one of his students, wrote to Spalatin about the effect of Luther's lectures in a letter of March 10th, 1516, quotes, "Very many students are all excited and enthusiastic about the lectures on the Bible and the early fathers, whereas the study of the scholastic doctors, so-called, attracts maybe 2 or 3 students," end quotes. Luther wrote to Lang himself the next year, May the 18th, 1517, quotes, "Our theology and St. Augustine are progressing well, and with God's help, rule at our university. Indeed, no one can expect to have any students if he does not want to teach this theology, that is, lecture on the Bible or St. Augustine or another father," church father, quotes. Eventually, the elector founded a chair of Greek, and young Philip Melanchthon was called to take it, the most promising humanist of his generation. Melanchthon's inaugural address in 1518 was the praise of classical Christian education, and it was a great success. Wittenberg became the gold standard for a humanist curriculum. The university grew from about 200 students to over 600. It was impossible to find rooms large enough for Melanchthon's lectures. Students read Cicero in Latin and the New Testament in Greek. Melanchthon's first published text in Wittenberg, he'd published before, was an edition of Cicero's De Officiis, and he explained why in the introduction. Quotes, "There is, moreover, on the subject of morals, no other book in existence more perfect than Cicero's On Duties. I think religion ought to be drawn from the sacred scriptures. Concerning civic morals, I would prefer to listen to Cicero, who was occupied with performing the greatest deeds in the chief commonwealth in the world, learned many things by experience, usu, as de Tocqueville was later to talk about the usage de la liberté of the Americans, and translated many things from the writings of the Greeks who governed the greatest cities," end quotes. The humanist Melanchthon reflects the views of his friend and colleague Martin Luther, who discusses Cicero in his table talks. Luther didn't teach Cicero, he was the Bible teacher at Wittenberg. But he loved Cicero, and after he got married and got control of the Augustinian monastery as his home, and his wife would prepare dinners and serve what was reputed to be very good beer, Luther would talk, and his remarks were copied by the people who attended. In 1532, he told his guests, quote, "I'm puzzled why nowadays they praise Aristotle's philosophy so much, not rather Cicero's. Cicero was a man deeply involved in political activity, which his duties, De Officiis, testifies to. It's a much better book than the Ethics of Aristotle, who was a man of leisure and overflowing with money. Cicero deals with reality, Aristotle with dialectic. Cicero res, Aristoteles dialecticam tractat." A couple of beers and Luther started talking Latin. In 1537, maybe we would too, maybe we should experiment with that. Ask Wittenberg to help us out there, I think that would be great. In 1537, he told his guests, quote, "Cicero is much better than Aristotle. In the Tusculan Disputations and on the nature of the gods, he writes excellently on the soul and its immortality. Aristotle's ethics are worthwhile, but the De Officiis of Cicero are better," end quotes. And a few more years later, in 1540, he told his guests, quote, "Cicero's much more learned than Aristotle, teaches what he has to say clearly. He taught philosophy well, but his book on duties, De Officiis, what an admirable volume. If I were a young man, I would dedicate myself to Cicero, but with a firm basis in the sacred scriptures." He told his students when lecturing in Isaiah chapter 9, "If I were not a Christian, I would seek wisdom and moral and political prudence. I would read some philosophical books, or Cicero's On Duties, which book has outstanding precepts on ethics and mores, and in this genre is written superlatively. Nothing can be proposed to young men for learning how to lead a moral life better, along with sweet character and humanity," end quotes. In his preface to the second volume of Luther's Latin writings, published in 1546, shortly after he passed, Melanchthon discussed Luther's student years. Quotes, this is Melanchthon on Luther when he was a young student. Quotes, "He read many works of the old Latin authors, Cicero, Virgil, Livy, and others. He used to read them not like schoolboys, noting only individual words to improve their vocabulary, but as instruction or illustrations of human life. So he paid close attention to the writer's advice and opinions, and since he had a reliable and solid memory, many things he had read and heard were in sight and before his eyes," in quotations. We're fortunate now to have Carl P. Springer's book, Cicero in Heaven, the Roman Rhetor and Luther's Reformation, published by Brill in 2018, a thorough and convincing exposition of the importance of Cicero for Luther and Lutheranism. And Cicero in Heaven, because in the table talks, Luther wishes that God would make an exception to some of the rules and let Cicero in. Why were Christian educators like Luther and Melanchthon so enthusiastic about a pagan like Cicero? The doctrine of the two kingdoms is helpful here. For Luther, God rules the world, not directly, but through two institutions. His church, kingdom of the right hand, offers word and sacrament, love, grace, and forgiveness to repentant and believing Christians. The state, kingdom of the left hand, administers the law over all its subjects, or in the case of a republic, citizens. For Luther, as for Paul in Romans 13, the state is instituted by God, a fear to the evil, not the good, and God's servant. Those are selections from Romans 13, verses 1 and 5 and 6. The Bible teaches us about the church, but there is a secular wisdom of the state. In Cicero, Luther and Melanchthon found an excellent source of this wisdom. One reason why Luther preferred Cicero to Aristotle is that Cicero lived his ethics and politics. He was not only a philosopher, speculating about ethical and political theory, he was an active and involved citizen who participated in public debate and electoral politics. Aristotle was a metic, a resident alien in democratic Athens, and not an active citizen. The perfection of his thinking was undermined by his lack of real-world experience. As Luther put it, Cicero res, Aristoteles dialecticam tractat. This is the context in which the Puritans of New England choose Cicero as essential for getting into Harvard. 200 years after Luther, Aristotle and Cicero had changed places in the eyes of educated men. David Hume expressed his time's communis opinio at the beginning of his important philosophical work, Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, published in 1748. David Hume says, quotes, "The fame of Cicero flourishes at present, but that of Aristotle is utterly decayed," end quotes. Because Cicero's philosophy, quotes, "enters more into common life, molds the heart and affections, reforms their conduct, and brings them nearer to that model of perfection it describes," end quotes. Hume's views were endorsed by young Count de Montesquieu long before he wrote his Spirit of the Laws. Quotes, young Montesquieu wrote, "Of all the ancients, Cicero is the one who has the most personal merit, the one I would most prefer to resemble," end quotes. The 18th century is often described as the age of the Enlightenment, but it is just as much, in fact, I think it is more, the age of Cicero. Cicero was a role model for exceptional 18th century figures from America and England. For example, he was John Adams' exemplar after he read Conyers Middleton's popular Life of Cicero, which he received as the Detour Prize at Harvard in 1755. That was the sort of head boy award for that year. In 1758, a few years later, when he was 23, he rejoiced that his profession was the law, quotes, "a field in which Demosthenes, Cicero, and others of immortal fame have exulted before me," end quotes. People are often asked, what influenced you to follow your career? Usually name a good teacher or a family friend or one of our parents. But for John Adams, it was Demosthenes and Cicero. They were his role models. His favorite exercise, you'll be shocked to hear, was not jogging, but reading Cicero out loud. He wrote on his diary for Thursday, the 21st of December, 1758, this is John Adams, quotes, "Yesterday and today I've read out loud Tullius, 4 orations against Catiline. The sweetness and grandeur of his sounds and the harmony of his numbers give pleasure enough to reward the reading if one understood none of his meaning. Besides, I find it a noble exercise. Exercises my lungs, raises my spirits, opens my pores, quickens the circulation, and so contributes much to health," end quotes. If you want to get your pores opened, read Cicero out loud. This will be my next health book on classical education and health. Adams' enthusiasm for Cicero never left him. In the summer of 1796, he prepared for his presidency. Imagine this. He prepared for his presidency by rereading Cicero's essays. After his defeat in the election of 1800, he wrote his good friend, Dr. Benjamin Rush, an impassioned defense of Cicero and so of himself. Although he had done so much for his country, Adams wrote, quote, Cicero was libeled, slandered, insulted by all parties. He was persecuted and tormented in turn by all parties and all factions, and that for his most virtuous and glorious actions. Pushed and injured and provoked as I am, I blush not to imitate the Roman, end quotes. Turning to Cicero for consolation was a family tradition. After losing the election of 1828 to Andrew Jackson, Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, spent an average of 2 hours a day for 10 months studying Cicero's Philippics and Plutarch's Lives of Cicero, Antony, and Brutus, noting parallels between Andrew Jackson and Julius Caesar and himself and Cicero. Still worried about the military taking over. Like John Adams, Edmund Burke in England rose from middle-class background as a lawyer to attain political distinction. His style is perhaps the most Ciceronian in English, although Edmund Gibbon could contest the title. Burke was known for his attempts to persuade the British Parliament to offer concessions to the American colonies and his opposition to the French Revolution. The first position led to his speech on conciliation with America, 1775, which used to be read in American high schools. If you go to an old used bookstore, you'll often see school texts on conciliation in America. His second position led to his book, Reflections on the Revolution in France, published in 1790, years before the Paris Terror. A work praised by Russell Kirk in his Conservative Mind of 1953 as the founding document of modern political conservatism. Burke, however, devoted almost 15 years working for the impeachment and conviction of Warren Hastings, the first Governor General of India. From 1781, he was the chairman of 2 parliamentary committees that investigated Hastings' activities in India. Burke wrote the official reports for both committees and presented them orally in Parliament. He denounced Hastings in a once famous speech, the Nabob of Arcot's debts, 1785. On April 4, 1786, he presented the articles of charge of high crimes and misdemeanors against Hastings over 4 days to Parliament. The House of Commons impeached Hastings on 20 charges, and he was then tried before the House of Lords. You notice our system is modeled on that. The House of Representatives impeaches, the Senate conducts the trial. Burke's passionate and brilliant oratory blackened Hastings' reputation, but Hastings was able to delay the trial for years, and the tide of popular opinion turned over the next 8 years. On April the 9th, 1794, Hastings' successor as Governor General of India, Lord Cornwallis, we Americans know who he is, when asked if he had, quotes, found any just cause to impeach the character of Mr. Hastings, answered in one word by bellowing, "Never!" Burke's reply to the defense lasted 9 days, over weeks from late May to mid-June 1794. The House of Lords found Hastings not guilty on all counts of the indictment. Burke's speeches on India and Hastings take up 3 of the 9 volumes of his writings and speeches, published by Oxford University Press from 1981 to 2015. Contemporaries knew that Burke's speeches for the prosecution were modeled on Cicero's prosecution of the corrupt and oppressive governor of Sicily, Gaius Verres, which fills an entire volume of the Oxford classical text of Cicero's orations. In the select orations of Cicero, edited by J.B. Greenough and G.L. Kittredge in 1896, which covers the entire range of Cicero's speeches, it was clearly meant for college kids, half of the argument of their selection from the Verrine orations is spent on comparisons with the prosecution of Hastings and his associates. The explanatory note cites substantial parallels from Burke's speeches. At one stage, 6 pages of the notes have not a single grammatical explanation. They're quoting Edmund Burke to explain Cicero. Burke's prosecution ended in failure and made him unpopular in Parliament for all the time they took on it. But Burke felt he had no choice. Cicero had prosecuted Verres, and imitating Cicero was the hallmark of a statesman and a patriot. Let me just mention one other briefly example of this. I quoted earlier Hume's praise of Cicero as having replaced Aristotle in popular estimation. One of Hume's last works was Dialogues on Natural Religion, that was an imitation of Cicero's De Natura Deorum. Even with his extensive writing of all sorts, he wanted to do one work that was an homage to Cicero, because that's what a wise and distinguished figure did in the 18th century. The founders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony thought Cicero essential for educated leaders. The faculty of our colleges and universities no longer feel this way. When did a classical education lose its cachet in America? Some feel this change occurred before the Revolution. Obviously, de Crèvecoeur thought so. One of them, who isn't as old as de Crèvecoeur, is Harvard's Bernard Bailyn, in his influential book, The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution, published in 1967. For Bernard Bailyn, the classics were a source of eloquent quotations and classical tags, but nothing more. The classics of the ancient world, Bailyn wrote, quotes, the classics of the ancient world are everywhere in the literature of the Revolution. That's clear. But they are everywhere illustrative, not illuminative of thought. They contributed a vivid vocabulary, but not the logic or grammar of thought, a universally respected personification, but not the source of political and social beliefs, end quotes. For Bailyn, this source was Whig political thought, like Cato's Letters, published from 1723 by Whig polemicists John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon. The libertarian think tank in Washington, D.C., that is called the Cato Institute, after the pseudonymous author of Cato's Letters, not the ancient. I think that Bailyn's decision can be questioned, that there were two separate traditions, Whig thought and the classics. In fact, after Trenchard died in 1723, Thomas Gordon devoted the rest of his life to translating Tacitus and Sallust, with introductions drawing Whig conclusions from ancient history. Classicist Meyer Reinhold wrote, quotes, there was hardly an American library of the revolutionary generation that did not boast of a copy of Gordon's Tacitus, end quotes. Thomas Jefferson has a letter after his retirement saying, I don't read the newspapers anymore, they're full of lies. That fortunately has changed, as we all know. I don't read the newspapers anymore, they're full of lies, I read Tacitus. And he means Gordon's Tacitus. The founders saw no contradiction between Whig polemics and theory and the classics, as Carl Richard wrote in his book, The Founders and the Classics in 1994, quotes, for the founders there was one great tradition, the tradition of liberty. Included both, end quotes. Over the generations after Bailyn's analysis, the time of the loss of classical influence has been pushed ever later. In the creation of the American Republic in 1969, 2 years after Bailyn, Gordon S. Wood insisted on the importance of classical antiquity for the intellectual life of the Revolutionary era. By the time of the Constitutional Convention, however, Wood felt the classics had lost their appeal. Carl Richard's Founders of the Classics in 1994 established the continuing influence of the classics as the source of heroes like Cicero and Cato and villains like Julius Caesar. For classicist Meyer Reinhold, the age of the founders was, quotes, the golden age of the classical tradition in America. In conscious critique of Reinhold, Carl Richard called his next book on the classics in America, in antebellum America, the golden age of the classics in America, 2009. It wasn't the revolution. Founding a new country based on the classics was even more important for Carl Richard. Carolyn Winterer's book, The Culture of Classicism, Ancient Greece and Rome in American Intellectual Life, 1780 to 1910, published in 2002, traced the influence of the classics into the 20th century. I think she's right, but she stops too soon. Latin continued to be a more commonly taught foreign language up to the middle of the 20th century. At its high point in 1962, almost 1 million high school students studied Latin in public schools and Catholic, Episcopalian, and Lutheran private, parochial, and congregational schools. I ask, is it an accident that 1963, the year after Latin reached its high point in enrollments, that 1963 was the year of the highest scores ever recorded on the College Board exams. And each year over the next 20 years, in the 60s and 70s, the number of Latin students grew fewer, and the College Boards got worse and worse. And plenty of explanations for this, but you know what mine is. Many scholars feel that the classics had lost their privileged position in American education and college at least before the First World War, and that's implied by Carl Richard and Carolyn Winter, who were great students of the classics in America. In my opinion, contemporary evidence suggests otherwise. Take, for example, the discussion of how America faced the challenge of combining Republican institutions with the pressure to participate in the growth of a worldwide empire. As this is found discussed in the college textbook, The Rise of American Civilization by the great American historian Charles Austin Beard and his wife, Mary Beard, one of the few examples of a textbook written by a truly great scholar. They devote several pages to this, but let's just listen to a few sentences. Quotes, either on account of logic, say the Beers, or Christian training, American thinkers shrank from an overt application of the Darwinian law to the struggle of nations for trade and territory. They were, of course, not unaware of the ancient creed, for they had heard about the theory and practice of Rome. In their school books, they'd read De Lega Manilia on the Manilian law, the panegyric by Cicero, which summed up in a single sentence the old doctrine of might. And then they quote their translation of Cicero. Quotes, do not hesitate for a moment in prosecuting with all your energies a war to preserve the glory of the Roman name, the safety of our allies, our rich revenues, and the fortunes of innumerable private citizens, end quotes. My favorite two words in that quotation are, of course. Of course they knew about the opinions, theory, and practice of Rome, because they'd read Cicero in their classes. The standard third-year Latin textbooks, not the fancy one I mentioned earlier, but the ordinary ones you can find all over the place in eBay, contained 6 Ciceronian orations you should have read before college. The 4 Catilinarians, the De Lega Manilia on the Manilian law, also known as On Pompey's Command or Imperium, and the Humanistic Proarchia. High school students learned that Rome was a republic that traded and fought all over the Mediterranean, just as America traded around the world, and after the Spanish-American War, ruled the Philippines. Let me go just for a minute beyond World War I. The importance of a classical education is assumed by Henry Cabot Lodge's critique of Woodrow Wilson in his book, The Senate and the League of Nations, in 1925. Henry Cabot Lodge was the Republican senator from Massachusetts who opposed Wilson's foreign policies. Most of the book criticizes Wilson's foreign policies, especially his dealings with Mexico, and explains why the Senate rejected American entry into the League of Nations. But at one point, Lodge pauses to make a cultural observation about Woodrow Wilson. And this is Henry Cabot Lodge. That he was a man of ability cannot be questioned. He always spoke well. His English was excellent. However, he was not a scholar in the true sense. To give one little illustration of what I mean, universal negatives are always perilous, but I can only say I never once noticed, but once, in any of Mr. Wilson's writings or speeches, a classical allusion. And then he quotes a speech he made in the rededication of the Congress Hall in Philadelphia. And this is Woodrow Wilson. Quotes, if you think too much about being reelected, it's very difficult to be worth reelecting. It's constantly necessary to come away from Washington to renew one's contact with people who don't swarm there, don't ask for anything, but who do trust you without their personal counsel to do your duty. Unless a man gets these contacts, he grows weaker and weaker. He needs them as Hercules needed the touch of Mother Earth. If you lift him up too high or he lifts himself too high, he loses the contact and therefore loses the inspiration, end quotes. And Henry Cabot Lodge comments, the classical allusion is contained in the last lines. I need hardly say that Hercules, who was the son of Jove and Alcmena, gained no strength from touching the earth. But in his wrestling contest with Antaeus, who was the son of Neptune and Terra, that is, of the ocean and the earth, he found Antaeus gained strength every time he touched the earth, and therefore, according to the story, Hercules held Antaeus in the air till the latter was weakened from lack of contact with his mother Earth, so that Hercules was able to crush him to death. The story is as popular as it is old. The point is, it seems incredible that Mr. Wilson should have made a blunder of this sort, which would not only be impossible to a scholar, but one would think impossible to an educated man, end quotes. Now, I need not quote what modern historians think of this criticism as the most unfair criticism ever made of any leader in the history of the United States. But let's see what it shows. There was a time, as late as after World War I, when America's leaders felt a classical blunder marked one out, not only as not a scholar, but as not even educated, however clever or articulate he was. And I frankly would go further than Senator Lodge, which I usually wouldn't do. A central figure in the tradition of classical republicanism is the citizen, and the model citizen is Cicero. The loss of contact with this tradition, shared with 15th century Florence and the American founding, led Victor Davis Hanson to write his book on the death of the citizen. True, it isn't a straightforward path. The Medici undermined classical republicanism in Florence. Saxony and Hesse never attained republican institutions, but admiration for Cicero and reading Cicero kept his ideals alive, and when the Pilgrims reached North America, they were finally able to realize those ideals. And in the Mayflower Compact, they say precisely, they are still loyal to their king, but they are forming a civil body politic, Latin, English, Greek. It's a body or group, it's politic, it's not ecclesiastic, which is a congregation, and it is the kind of political body consisting, it's civil, the adjective civilis for the noun cives, citizen. It's a political group formed of citizens. Let me just end by reminding us not only about the theory again, but about Cicero the man. Our own time admires the specialist, the expert, during the great creative age of the modern period, from the Renaissance and Reformation through the American founding, and I think into the 20th century, the opposite was true. Men as different as philosopher David Hume, statesman Edmund Burke, founding father John Adams, took Cicero as their model in their careers and writing. Bright amateurs knew Cicero in a way that only specialists do today. In fact, more accurately, if you include Hume, Burke, and Adams as bright amateurs, they knew him in ways that no specialist does today, because today's specialists do not model their lives on Cicero. His influence encouraged the educated to strive for lives that balanced philosophical thought and political action, while it inspired the superior to achieve greatly. And many things we haven't had time to mention. Locke's theory of property, which he didn't get from Plato and Aristotle. He got it from Cicero. The dialogues on natural religion of David Hume. The care Thomas Jefferson devoted to his letters. 2/3 of the library of the America's volume of Jefferson are letters, not books or the Declaration. The years Burke spent prosecuting Warren Hastings. These are only some aspects of the 18th century decisively influenced by Cicero's life and example, and still influential to these days. Hume and Locke and Burke are still studied, are still influential. Cicero can provide that model for today's world and tomorrow's. No other style of education offers their students a better curriculum than classical Lutheran education. It also supplements that curriculum with the opportunity to meet great people like Jesus and Socrates and, yes, Cicero. Thank you for your kind attention.